My brother stole my business and told everyone I was too stupid to run it. 5 years later, he tried to sue me for millions. But when I set a flash drive on the judge's desk, his eyebrows shot up. He leaned forward and asked, "Do they realize what's on this?" I just smiled and waited to speak. This isn't just a story about business. It's about a betrayal so profound. It carved a wound that refused to heal, setting me on a path of quiet, calculated vengeance against the one person I should have been able to trust implicitly, my own brother. What unfolded over the next 5 years was a slow, agonizing game of chess, culminating in a moment of pure, unadulterated satisfaction. My name's Adrian, and I'm 32 now, but this all really began when I was 24, a time when I still believed in family loyalty, in the unbreakable bond between brothers. I grew up with Marcus, my older brother. He was the golden child, charismatic, able to talk his way out of anything, and he knew it. Teachers adored him. Our parents practically worshipped the ground he walked on, and if Marcus wanted something, it was only a matter of time before it was his. I was different, quieter, more of a thinker, a builder. While Marcus was out charming everyone at parties, I was tucked away in our garage, sketching ideas, tinkering, figuring out how to make something real from scratch. By the time I hit 23, I'd actually done it. I'd surprised everyone, even myself. I started a small but incredibly promising logistics software company right out of my apartment. All I had was an ancient laptop, a thrift store desk, and an obsession with efficiency that probably scared off more dates than I care to admit. I worked every spare moment, nights, weekends, any time I wasn't doing contract jobs, just to keep the lights on. Slowly, painstakingly, the code got better. I landed my first client, then 2 more. By the end of that first year, I had 5 steady contracts, enough to finally quit my side gigs. That's when Marcus finally noticed. He'd never really asked about my work before, not genuinely, but suddenly, he was calling me for brotherly advice. He'd show up at my apartment with coffee, an uncharacteristically generous gesture, and ask about the software. I was so naive, I thought he was proud of me. Maybe in some twisted way he was, but certainly not in the way I'd hoped. A few months later, he hit me with his brilliant idea. "Adrian," he said over dinner one night, leaning back like he'd already closed the deal, "we should partner up. You've got the tech genius, I've got the business mind. Think about it. You're good at building things. I'm good at making money with them. Together, we could double, even triple what you're pulling in now." I hesitated. Marcus had charm, absolutely. But I also knew he loved shortcuts, and in business, shortcuts usually meant someone else got burned. Still, he was my brother. Against every gut instinct, I agreed to bring him in as a minority partner. I figured I could handle the operations, keep control. We drew up a basic contract, clear enough. I'd keep 70% ownership, he'd get 30% and handle client acquisition. For a while, it actually worked. Marcus landed a few big contracts faster than I ever could have alone. We moved into a small office, hired 2 part-time developers, upgraded our equipment. I even started to think maybe I'd been wrong about him. But then, the cracks started to show. Marcus would promise clients features we hadn't even discussed, leaving me scrambling to deliver things we weren't ready for. He'd take meetings without looping me in, and I'd later find out he'd quoted prices far higher than we'd agreed, pocketing the difference himself without a word. When I confronted him, he'd just flash that infuriating smile and say, "Relax, little brother. I'm just making sure we both eat well." Then came the day. The memory of it still makes my stomach twist. I walked into the office one morning to find our 2 developers, Maya and Ben, looking incredibly uneasy. Maya pulled me aside, her voice a tense whisper. Marcus, she said, had called a meeting the night before, without me, and told them I was stepping down to focus on coding while he took over as CEO. She thought it was strange, especially since I hadn't mentioned anything. I confronted Marcus immediately. He didn't even try to deny it. He just leaned back in my chair, his feet propped on my desk, and smirked. "Face it, Adrian," he said, "you're brilliant, but you're not cut out to run a company. You get too hung up on the details. I'm going to take us to the next level. That was the first time I saw the real plan, stark and brutal. And the worst part? The contract we'd signed had a clause, one he'd insisted on adding, that allowed either partner to buy out the other with a simple majority vote. With his 30% and the shares he'd convinced Maya and Ben to sign over in exchange for inflated salaries, he had 60%. Just like that, my company, my creation, was gone. He handed me a check for what he called my share and told me I should be grateful. It was insultingly low, barely enough to cover my living expenses for a few months. I didn't fight it. Not then. I was too stunned, too sick with the feeling that I'd been played in the most vicious way possible by my own brother. My parents, of course, sided with Marcus. He's the older brother, my dad said, as if that explained everything. He knows what he's doing. Mom just shook her head, muttering, "You're too sensitive, Adrian. Business is business." In the weeks that followed, I moved through a fog. I watched from the outside as Marcus plastered his face across industry articles, bragging about his innovations, my innovations. Friends reached out, confused about why I'd left, and I gave them vague answers. I couldn't bring myself to admit I'd been utterly blindsided by my own flesh and blood. But while I kept my mouth shut publicly, inside, something hardened. I started paying attention, watching his moves, and little by little, I began to notice things Marcus didn't want anyone to see. And then one night, over a drink with an old client, I learned something that made my pulse quicken. Something Marcus would never want anyone to know. I didn't act immediately. I waited. 5 years, to be exact. 5 years to build something new, something better. 5 years to put myself in a position where, when the time came, I wouldn't just get even. I'd end it all for him. And that moment was about to arrive. In the years after Marcus took the company, I learned to live with a quiet, persistent bitterness. It was like carrying a shard of glass in my chest, not enough to kill me, but sharp enough to hurt every single time I thought about it. I kept my distance from family gatherings, not that I was really invited much anymore. When I did show up, Marcus was always front and center, telling exaggerated stories about his successes while our parents beamed at him like he'd just invented the internet. If I so much as corrected a detail, Mom would touch my arm and murmur, "Don't start, Adrian," as though I were the one picking a fight. He'd lean into it, too. "You know, little brother," he'd say, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I still can't believe you used to try running that company. You were drowning in spreadsheets while I was bringing in real clients." People would chuckle awkwardly, and I'd force a smile, but my stomach would not every single time. The worst part was, he didn't just rewrite history at family dinners, he did it in public. I'd run into old colleagues who would say things like, "Man, Marcus really saved that company after you left. Must have been a relief for you." At first, I tried explaining what really happened, but Marcus was always a step ahead, spinning the story so thoroughly that my words sounded like sour grapes. Eventually, I stopped trying. I poured all that energy into starting over. My new business, under a different name, with absolutely no family involvement, grew slowly but steadily. I kept my profile low, deliberately avoiding press or flashy announcements. The last thing I wanted was for Marcus to notice I was doing well. But he still found ways to needle me. One time, at my parents' anniversary party, he sidled up to me with a glass of champagne and said, "So, still doing that little freelance thing? I mean, good for you, man. Not everyone's built for the big leagues." He clapped me on the shoulder like he was offering encouragement. I felt the heat rise in my face, but I kept my voice even. "It's going fine." He smirked like he knew exactly how much that answer cost me. Our parents didn't help. Dad would brag about Marcus's latest deal, then look at me with that faint frown, like I was an ongoing disappointment. Mom would slip me gentle hints about patching things up with my brother, saying it was foolish to hold grudges in business. I never told her that Marcus had completely cut me out of the market we once worked in together, going as far as blacklisting me with certain clients. One of those clients, a mid-sized shipping company, called me out of the blue one day. The owner, whom I'd worked with years before, sounded almost apologetic. "Adrian," he said, "I wanted to reach out because I heard you've been doing your own thing. I'd love to work with you again, but Well, Marcus told us you'd left the industry after a breakdown. He said it was best we didn't drag you back into it. I remember sitting there, holding the phone in silence for a long beat. A breakdown? That's what he was telling people now. Not that he'd pushed me out. Not that he'd rewritten the company's ownership. No, in his version, I was just too fragile to handle the pressure, and he'd nobly stepped in to save the day. That was the moment I stopped thinking of Marcus as a brother and started thinking of him as something else entirely, an opponent. Someone who played a long game, but not as long as mine. The more I heard, the clearer it became that he was getting sloppy. Whispers about overpromising and underdelivering, delayed projects, even rumors that he'd been shifting company funds into a personal account. I didn't jump at it. I just filed it away. Every little misstep, every loose thread. And then came the charity gala, a big, flashy event for local entrepreneurs. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need to be. Pictures of Marcus were all over social media the next morning, smiling in a tux, posing with politicians. And in one shot that made me pause, he was standing with a man I recognized from years ago, a man who'd been convicted for running a shady overseas import scheme. That image stuck in my head like a spark on dry grass. Because if Marcus was working with him, there was a good chance Marcus had left behind a trail. And if I could find it, I'd finally have what I needed. I didn't know yet just how tangled that trail would be or how, a few years later, Marcus would walk straight into my hands. It was almost exactly 5 years to the day since Marcus had taken my company when the betrayal that finally tipped the scales landed in my lap. By then, I had rebuilt my life. My second business, a streamlined logistics platform with a very different model, was thriving quietly, carefully, under the radar. I didn't flaunt it. Didn't announce acquisitions. Didn't put my name on magazine covers. I wanted freedom, not a spotlight. But I was earning more than I ever had with Marcus. Enough to buy a modest home, employ a small, loyal team, and most importantly, sleep at night knowing my work was mine. Then came the email. It was from a client I'd been working with for nearly 2 years, a warehouse distribution firm run by a practical, no-nonsense woman named Evelyn Grant. She and I had built up a strong professional relationship. We had trust, which is why her message hit me like a punch in the chest. Adrian, it read, I regret to inform you we won't be renewing our contract next quarter. Marcus approached us with a competing offer that undercuts your rates by 25%. He also mentioned some concerns about your mental stability and hinted at a history of unreliability. I'm not sure what's true, but given his industry reputation, the board felt safer moving forward with him. I'm sorry. I read that last line 3 times before it fully sank in. He'd done it again. Not just poached a client, but used the exact same ugly, fabricated narrative he'd spun years ago to undermine me. The idea of him sitting in some sleek office, grinning as he drove the knife in, made my jaw ache from clenching it. For a few hours, I paced my living room, torn between calling Evelyn to set the record straight and doing something far more impulsive. But anger wasn't my weapon. Patience was. I sat down, forced myself to breathe, and started connecting dots. Evelyn's company wasn't just any client. They were deeply tied to several major freight hubs. If Marcus had cut a deal with them, he'd either need to offer technology equal to mine, which he didn't have, or promise features that didn't exist yet. And knowing Marcus, that second option was much, much more likely. The next day, I called a friend who worked in compliance for a mid-tier shipping firm. We'd helped each other out on small things over the years, and I knew he had ears in places Marcus didn't think to watch. I asked him casually if he'd heard anything about Marcus's company recently. His voice dropped. Between you and me, he said, there's chatter that he's been moving client data overseas. Not illegal exactly, but risky. And with the partners he's working with. He trailed off. Let's just say it's a matter of time before it bites him. That was interesting enough. But then about a week later, I got a call from Maya. Yes, the same developer who'd been with me back in the old days. She'd left Marcus's company the year after I was ousted, and we'd kept loose contact. Her voice was tense. Adrian, I think you need to know this. Marcus is bidding on a government logistics contract, a big one. But here's the thing, he's using some of your old code. The stuff we worked on together. It's buried deep, but I recognized it instantly. My pulse spiked. My original code, the one I'd written years before, back when the company was still mine. I had all the originals, timestamps, repository logs. If Marcus was repackaging it for a government contract, that meant two things. First, he was infringing on my intellectual property. And second, if that code didn't meet updated compliance standards, which it absolutely did not, it could cause catastrophic failures in a system the government depended on. The realization hit me like a cold wave. Marcus wasn't just undercutting me. He was playing with fire, and he had no idea how fast it could burn him. I didn't tip my hand. I thanked Maya, stored every detail she gave me, and started pulling backups from my old drives, every commit, every change log, every piece of proof that the foundation of his innovation was mine. And that's when the true emotional turning point arrived. Not a flash of rage, but something colder, steadier. This wasn't about stealing a client anymore. This was about dismantling Marcus's empire from the inside out. And now, for the first time, I had something tangible. The timing would have to be perfect. I needed to wait for him to make the next move, the one that would give me a legal opening so wide I could drive a truck through it. I didn't have to wait long. 3 months later, a thick envelope landed in my mailbox, stamped with the seal of the county courthouse. Marcus was suing me for millions in lost profits, claiming that my new business was infringing on his proprietary methods. It was absurd. It was laughable. And it was the biggest mistake he'd ever make. The day I opened that envelope, I knew Marcus had finally crossed the line into outright self-destruction. But I also knew he was about to drag me through hell before I could do anything about it. The lawsuit wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a declaration of war wrapped in a smug kind of arrogance only Marcus could muster. He accused me of stealing his exclusive systems, damaging his brand, and poaching his clients. The irony almost made me laugh, but the numbers didn't. He was suing for $3.2 million. My first instinct was to toss it in the shredder and pretend it didn't exist. But the problem was, ignoring it would mean an automatic judgment against me. So I called a lawyer, an old contact from my early days, who was as blunt as they came. He skimmed through the documents and let out a low whistle. "This is going to cost you," he said. "Even if we win, he's going to bury you in motions and paperwork. You're looking at months, maybe over a year of this." That was the part that stung. I wasn't broke by any means, but legal fees could bleed you dry faster than a bad investment. I'd worked so hard to build my second business carefully, avoiding risky moves, and now I was staring at the possibility of watching it erode, not because I'd done anything wrong, but because my brother decided to throw a tantrum in a courthouse. The next few weeks were brutal. I was juggling client deadlines, endless calls with my lawyer, and the constant, gnawing anxiety that Marcus might win just by outspending me into submission. The stress crept into everything. My appetite vanished. I'd lie awake at night replaying conversations in my head, and even my employees noticed I was quieter, more withdrawn. I didn't tell them what was going on. I didn't want them worrying or thinking the company was in trouble. And of course, Marcus wasn't content to let the court filings do the talking. Word got around, deliberately, I'm sure, that I was being sued for fraud. I lost 2 potential contracts within a month, both citing uncertainty as the reason. My phone became a double-edged sword. Every time it rang, I hoped it was good news, but more often than not, it was another problem. There was one night I'll never forget. It was about 2 a.m., and I was sitting at my desk with a stack of documents, my laptop glowing in the dim light. I'd just finished reviewing yet another motion Marcus's lawyers had filed, something petty and time-wasting, designed to rack up my expenses. My hands were shaking, partly from exhaustion, partly from the sheer weight of it all. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and for the first time in years, thought about walking away entirely, selling the business, leaving the city, disappearing somewhere he couldn't touch me. But then I remembered Maya's voice, the government contract, my old code buried inside his systems, the whispers from my compliance contact about shady overseas deals. And I realized something important. Marcus thought this lawsuit was his way of breaking me. But what he didn't understand was that he had just invited me into a legal arena where all of his skeletons could be dragged into the light. It was the first time in weeks I felt a flicker of control. I started organizing everything I had, every email, every timestamp backup, every photo, every snippet of information about his questionable partners, not as a desperate defense, but as the beginnings of something far more dangerous. I stopped pacing the floor at night. I started sleeping again, though my dreams were sharp and calculated. I let Marcus think I was on the defensive, because the longer he believed that, the more reckless he would get. And when the right moment came, I'd be ready to turn all of it against him. What I didn't know yet was that the right moment was coming faster than I'd expected, and it would arrive in the form of a single phone call that changed everything. That phone call came on a Tuesday morning, right when I'd started to settle into the rhythm of balancing my business and the lawsuit. I recognized the number immediately, Evelyn Grant, the client Marcus had stolen from me months earlier. I almost didn't answer. Part of me didn't want to reopen that wound, but curiosity got the better of me. Her voice was polite, but I could hear something underneath it, a trace of unease. "Adrian," she began, "I wanted to reach out. I know we left things abruptly, and I'm not calling to change our contract situation, but I think you should know Marcus has missed 2 major deadlines for us. And the last delivery he pushed through, it crashed our tracking system for over a week. My board isn't happy." I could have gloated. I could have said, "Told you so." Instead, I just listened. Evelyn went on to say they were already considering pulling out of their agreement with him, but they couldn't risk downtime during the transition. That was the moment a thought began forming. I didn't need to take Marcus down in one strike. I could let his own failures chip away at him while I positioned myself as the safe, reliable alternative. I ended the call on good terms, promised her nothing, but made a mental note. Marcus's cracks were widening. Over the next month, I worked with quiet precision. I focused on my own clients, delivering ahead of schedule, tightening our security protocols, and even introducing a few features I'd been sitting on for a while, ones I knew Marcus couldn't replicate without my original code. The lawsuit was still draining my time, but the discipline it forced on me had a strange side effect. My operations became leaner, faster, more adaptable. My team noticed the shift, and their confidence in me seemed to double. Meanwhile, I started reconnecting with old industry contacts. Carefully, casually, I'd ask how business was going, mention that I was working on some interesting new projects, and leave it at that. People talked, and word began to spread that I was still very much in the game and thriving. The real turning point came when a former investor from my first company reached out. We hadn't spoken since before Marcus forced me out, but apparently, he'd been keeping tabs on the industry. He told me flat out that he regretted ever backing Marcus over me. "If you're ever looking for capital," he said, "I'm ready to put money behind you. No strings this time." It wasn't just the money, though that was tempting. It was the shift in perception. People who had once believed Marcus's version of events were starting to question it. My quiet competence was beginning to contrast sharply with his flashy instability. At the same time, my lawyer and I were combing through discovery in the lawsuit. We started seeing things Marcus probably assumed no one would notice: unexplained financial transfers, gaps in project documentation, and discrepancies in licensing agreements. It was all small on its own, but together it painted a pattern. I wasn't ready to move yet, but I could feel the balance tilting. Marcus was still the one throwing punches, but I was starting to set the arena. The lawsuit had given me a direct line into the inner workings of his company. And soon, I'd have more than just defensive proof. I'd have ammunition. And then one evening, I got an email from Maya with the subject line, "You're going to want to see this." Attached was a copy of a subcontract agreement between Marcus's company and a shell corporation registered overseas. The signature on the document wasn't his. It was someone else's. Someone I recognized from that charity gala years ago. The moment I saw it, I knew this was the thread. If I pulled on it, the whole sweater would unravel. When I opened Maya's attachment, I sat back in my chair and just stared at the screen for a long moment. The subcontract was between Marcus's company and a foreign entity I'd heard of before, a logistics consultancy operating out of Singapore that was really just a front for funneling contracts and data into shadier hands. And the signature? It belonged to Victor Harrow, the same man I'd seen standing beside Marcus at that charity gala years ago. That connection alone was dangerous for Marcus. But when I looked closer at the terms of the subcontract, my pulse started to quicken. They were moving not just client data, but portions of the government contract software architecture. The same contract Maya had told me included my original code, which meant Marcus wasn't just infringing on my intellectual property. He was potentially violating national security clauses without even realizing the legal gravity of it. I didn't tell Maya how big this was. I just thanked her and asked if she could quietly keep monitoring the development branches she still had access to through an old, overlooked account. She agreed, sending me occasional updates that painted an even clearer picture. Marcus was rushing deliverables, bypassing QA entirely, and quietly shifting his development work to contractors with no clearance. The problem, or the opportunity, was that I couldn't just dump this information into the court records without it looking like I'd gone on some personal vendetta. I needed it to surface naturally as part of discovery or a chance revelation in the lawsuit, so the judge couldn't ignore it. That meant patience and precision. Around this time, the investor who'd reached out to me earlier called again, this time with a proposition. He had contacts in the government's Procurement Oversight Committee. If I could provide proof that a major contractor was mishandling classified software or subcontracting in violation of security protocols, he could make sure it reached the right eyes anonymously. I didn't commit yet, but I kept his number close. Then came the break I needed. During a routine exchange of documents in the lawsuit, Marcus's attorneys accidentally included an internal email chain, heavily redacted, but not enough to hide the essentials. In it, a project manager expressed urgent concern about the subcontract with Victor's company, warning that they might not meet compliance checks. Marcus's reply was chillingly casual. Don't worry about compliance. They'll never look that closely. That was gold. Not just for my case, but for the bigger picture. I now had Marcus's own words brushing off a compliance risk tied to a government deal. It wasn't enough to end him on its own, but it was the perfect piece to tie together with what Maya had sent me. So, I started building a file. Not a messy pile of gotcha screenshots, but a clean, chronological, bulletproof dossier. Dates, signatures, code repository logs, financial transfers, emails, the subcontract, everything neatly labeled, cross-referenced, and most importantly, backed by verifiable sources. My lawyer didn't even know the full scope yet. I wanted this to be my card to play at exactly the right moment. At the same time, I began positioning myself publicly, just enough to make Marcus nervous. I accepted 2 speaking invitations at industry conferences. Nothing flashy, just technical talks on data security and logistics software, but I made sure they were well attended, well received, and picked up by a few trade publications. My name was starting to surface again, this time in a context Marcus couldn't easily smear without looking petty. Behind the scenes, I also shored up my own defenses. I had my company's code audited by a third party, documented every client agreement, and even brought in a second lawyer, one with experience in corporate fraud cases. If Marcus tried to escalate, I wanted to be able to pivot from defense to offense in an instant. The more I worked, the calmer I felt. It was like setting up dominoes. Each piece had to be placed just right. And when the time came, I wouldn't need to shove them. I'd just flick one with my finger and watch the whole thing collapse. And then, right on cue, Marcus did exactly what I was hoping for. He filed a motion demanding that I produce all source code related to my current business, claiming it was derivative of his. My lawyer advised fighting it. I told him to let it through, because I knew the moment Marcus's team got their hands on my code, they'd compare it to his and see the differences. And if the court ordered him to produce his own for comparison, the buried pieces of my original code and the traces of that shady subcontract would come spilling into the light. The court granted Marcus's motion to examine my code, and just as I predicted, his lawyers pounced on it like they'd struck gold. They sent over their forensic expert to review my systems, clearly expecting to find stolen fragments they could twist into an infringement claim. I welcomed them in with a polite smile and gave them full, well-organized access. Every file, every log, Every timestamp was clean, airtight, and entirely mine. What they didn't realize was that the court order worked both ways. If they wanted to compare my code to theirs, they had to submit their own repository for inspection. My lawyer filed the request that same afternoon. Marcus fought it, of course, filed objections, tried to delay, but the judge wasn't buying it. Within 2 weeks, his code was on a secure drive in the hands of a neutral examiner. That was the moment I sat back and let the trap close, because I already knew what they'd find. The examiner's review was meticulous, and when the preliminary report came back, it was better than I could have scripted. Large portions of Marcus's supposedly proprietary system were copied directly from my original pre-split code, right down to unique comments and function names I'd written years ago. Not only that, but certain modules contained dependencies tied to the subcontract with Victor's overseas shell company, which had no authorization to handle government-related software. My lawyer's eyes widened when he read it. "Adrian," he said, "this isn't just IP theft. If this gets out, it's a federal contract violation, potentially criminal." I knew, and that was exactly why I'd kept my mouth shut until now. We filed a motion to introduce the findings as part of my defense, attaching only the relevant portions of the examiner's report. It was surgical. No accusations, no dramatic claims, just undeniable facts presented with quiet precision. Marcus's legal team scrambled, trying to discredit the examiner, but the judge ordered a second independent review. The results matched perfectly. Behind the scenes, I took the next step. I reached out to that investor with government contacts and sent over a distilled, evidence-based packet. Not my entire dossier, just enough to raise the right eyebrows in the oversight committee. I made it clear it was for compliance purposes, not revenge. Let the machinery of bureaucracy do what it does best. Within a month, whispers started circulating. A confidential inquiry had been opened into one of the government's logistics contractors. I didn't need to hear Marcus's name to know who they meant. His tone in court changed. Less smug, more clipped. His lawyers started asking for continuances, clearly buying time while they tried to figure out how much trouble he was really in. And then came the moment I'd been waiting for. We were in a pretrial conference, sitting across from each other at a long oak table. Marcus was wearing his usual tailored suit, but his collar was slightly askew, and there was a sheen of sweat on his temple. My lawyer slid a small, sealed envelope across the table to his counsel. Inside was a single USB flash drive labeled only with a date and a case number. His attorney opened it, glanced at the contents, and froze. I watched the color drain from Marcus's face as his lawyer leaned in and whispered something. The judge, curious, asked what it contained. Marcus's lawyer hesitated, then handed it over. The judge plugged it into the court's secure laptop, brows furrowing as he scrolled through the files. Then, slowly, he looked up. "Do they realize what's on here?" he asked, his voice measured. I didn't say a word. I just smiled, leaned back in my chair, and waited. The judge's question hung in the air for a beat too long. Marcus shifted in his seat, his confident facade cracking just enough for me to see the panic behind his eyes. His lawyer cleared his throat and tried to suggest a private discussion, but the judge shook his head. "This is relevant to the case and to the integrity of a federal contract. I'm ordering it entered into the record." What followed was a slow-motion collapse. The flash drive contained the examiner's report, the subcontract with Victor's shell company, and repository logs showing my original code woven into Marcus's system, all tied neatly to the government contract. The judge didn't shout or gloat. He simply said a hearing would be scheduled to determine whether the matter should be referred to federal authorities. The way he said referred made it sound less like a possibility and more like a certainty. Marcus's composure melted over the next few weeks. In court, he stopped smirking. He stopped looking me in the eye altogether. Outside the courtroom, I started hearing from industry contacts that clients were quietly pulling out of deals with him, citing compliance concerns. Evelyn, the client he'd stolen from me, sent me a short but telling message: "He's finished." The federal inquiry moved fast, faster than I'd expected. Agents seized company records. Victor disappeared from the country overnight. By the time the court date for my lawsuit rolled around again, Marcus was facing not only the dismissal of his case against me, but the very real prospect of criminal charges for fraud and contract violations. In the end, the judge ruled in my favor without hesitation. Marcus's claims were baseless, his evidence non-existent, and the counterclaims my lawyer filed left him on the hook for my legal fees. The number wasn't small. Neither was the damage to his reputation. His company's stock, privately held but still tracked by industry reports, was valued at less than half of what it had been 6 months earlier. The last time I saw him in person was in the courthouse hallway after the final hearing. He looked smaller somehow, as if the sharp edges of his confidence had been worn down. He opened his mouth like he might say something, but I just walked past him, my steps steady, my head high. A month later, I heard he'd sold what was left of the company to cover debts and avoid total bankruptcy. The irony was almost poetic. He'd taken my business from me, only to destroy his own by building it on stolen foundations. I never reached out. There was nothing left to say. One rainy evening, long after it was all over, I found myself at my desk again. Same desk, different man. I opened the drawer where I'd kept that flash drive, turned it over in my hand, and thought about all the years I'd waited for this moment. Then I placed it back inside, shut the drawer, and whispered to the empty room, "Checkmate."